Hey viewers, welcome to History in Lowell with me, Maritza Grooms, and my favorite professor, Bob Forrant.
I still have that title, huh?
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's good, that's good. I like it.
It'll be really hard to lose it at this point.
Oh good, okay. I'd have to really mess up, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'll be careful.
I don't think there's anything that you could do. You just gave me a stack of books. You're 100% solidified as my favorite.
I figured that would buy me grace for at least 6 months. So.
Yeah. So viewers, today we're going to do something a little different. We're not going to be focusing in so much on Lowell. Bob, what are we going to be talking about today?
So I think the last week and a half, 2 weeks, the sort of more outspoken attacks on immigrants and refugees and use of language about invasions and hordes and disease, as well as then the massacre in El Paso and what happened in Toledo, I've been struck by how many people who I think are on the progressive side of the issue somehow still think of this stuff as an aberration. And say we're better than that. This doesn't happen in America. This isn't America. And when you look at the history, it's sadly not necessarily the case. It just depends which historical lens one's looking through. And if you're not of a community that had this stuff done to you, then you haven't seen it or heard about it, and so you think, well, wow, this is really weird. This doesn't happen in America. And that kind of, I think that self-righteousness on the part of the people that speak that way defeats the purpose of trying to really do what we've been doing for these many months, of really trying to dig in and understand the history. So I suggested to you that that's what we talk about, and I did not think you would say no.
And you were right. Because we just did a really great series with the national parks, which was, first of all, just an honor to do with you. It's been so cool to do that. But it was also really empowering for me to be able to be on that side of things and be the educator about race in Lowell, especially with that lens on Black history and things like that. So that's what we're going to be talking about.
And you're a natural born educator, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Oh, my head is so big.
You got it. You got it.
Oh, wow. Well, now these lights are brighter. So 100 years ago, we're going back. And this is something, as you said, and I hate to use this phrase, but for me, knowing what I know, it's as American as apple pie. The massacres of whole communities of people.
You know who said that?
Who said that?
H. Rep. Brown, civil rights activist, said violence is American as apple pie.
Wow. Now I'm just channeling my ancestors.
There you go.
This is crazy. Okay, this is turned into a really great day. So, I mean, the topic is not so great though. 100 years ago, 1919, and folks always say, oh, well, slavery happened so long ago, we have to get over it. And when we're talking about issues of racism and the way that Black Americans are treated now, even, people are like, oh, you need to get over it. Why are we always making things about race? But 100 years ago, a series of massacres were happening in America across different states. And tell us more about that.
So you have to go back a little bit to the end of the Civil War. There's a brief sort of open window of what historians call Reconstruction, when for a time federal troops occupied the South, the former Confederacy, and attempts were made to actually enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, civil rights, voting rights, ability to sit on courts, ability to travel without having to get a pass, ability to go find a job where you want to and not be rooted to a plantation or whatever. And as well, out of that came the election of lots of African Americans to state legislatures, to Congress, to mayors of cities. And so there's this burgeoning progress, you could say, somewhat that people, anti-slavery advocates before the Civil War, envisioned that if you gave this freedom, but fairly quickly, so this is 1865, the war ends. 1877, Reconstruction's over. So it's like a very tiny window. It's 12 years. And political deals get made in the presidential election of 1876. It's too arcane to spend time on. But suffice to say, one of the deals that gets made is that federal troops are pulled out of the South. And when the federal troops are pulled out of the South and the protections for people trying to vote, register to vote, all those things wither away, then so does the election of people And you get the reemergence, actually you get the birth of the first KKK, Ku Klux Klan, just an incredible amount of violence. And so jump forward toward the end of the 19th century, by the 1890s, there's been a series of lynchings and other overt violence against black people in the South, people basically being taken from jails, being charged with a crime. Most of the time, in hindsight, people realized they didn't do, and either lynched or beaten to death or whatever it would be. And people are now beginning to, so the NAACP forms during this period of time. People are trying to create federal laws against lynching and things like that. Doesn't get anywhere.
Yeah, that still isn't a thing.
Exactly, that still isn't. It's hard to imagine, or maybe it isn't. But anyway, it's still not a thing. And so then by around 1900, 1905, there's a merger of hate, which is against immigrants and against African Americans. And the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists in the South and in the North as well now sort of meld together, being anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-Italian, anti-African American, anti-Native American. It's the gestalt of hate, sort of all rolled into one.
I immediately think of axis of power, merger of hate.
Yeah, and
This is terrible.
so now you've got this big ball of fury rolling along. First World War sort of interrupts it. The country somewhat comes together around the fighting of the First World War and patriotism and the flag and all of that. But what begins to happen during the war is lots of African Americans who have been subject to this terror in the South begin what historians call the Great Migration. So people are flooding out of places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, heading to the West Coast, heading right up the Mississippi River into the heart of the country, all the way up into places like Chicago and Detroit. There's lots of wartime jobs. There's lots of factories. There's lots of industry.
Almost as if they're refugees.
Yeah, pretty much. You could. That's good. That's what I mean about you being a natural-born educator. Yeah, you could say they're fleeing their home for the sake of safety. Lots of parents actually will stay, but they'll send their kids. So kids as young as 11 and 12 will be sent to Auntie in Chicago or Detroit away from their parents, or to Ohio or to someplace where, because the parents look at the kid and say, you've got a mouth, you're not going to be safe here, go.
Yeah.
And so here's the interesting thing, which I think partly precipitates what happens in 1919. During the war, significant numbers of African Americans enlist in the military and go abroad and fight in the First World War. They come back and they say, well, wait, I could go there and be shot at to defend the flag, but I come back here and I can't vote. That I'm not buying that picture anymore. And so that smacks up against the country trying at large, trying to reinstitute segregation and get back where you belong and go back to where you came, same rhetoric, go back where you came from. And so what precipitates a lot of this, and again, it's hard to believe for people that don't understand the history, but in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, African Americans in uniform returned from the war were lynched on lampposts in Washington, D.C. Right?
When I say this country never really loved us.
But, and so again, lots of the people that went through the war, again, just think, okay, no, we're not stepping back now. Like, we've tried to do it, this kind of like gradual way, and sort of like a civil rights song was chant back and forth, how long, too long, how long, too long. And so people are saying too long. It's 1865, the war's over for now almost 50 years.
Yeah.
And here we sit. And so the summer, when the war concludes, the country's a mess. There's an economic decline in 1918 and 1919 because all the war production slows.
Right.
And so lots of people are out of work. You've got lots of soldiers, white and black, coming back now, and they don't have jobs. You've now had this migration, and you have significant African American populations living in cities where they had not lived before, and so people could tut-tut about the South. But wait, now there's a lot of black people in Detroit or Chicago. You know, how are we gonna? And so that basically is the combustible fuel.
It also brings to mind the whole issue of kneeling during the national anthem, when people are like, "Oh, but what about the veterans? What about those veterans?"
Right.
That's what it all goes hand in hand.
Yeah. I mean, Jackie Robinson, who's lionized for being the first person to integrate baseball, one of his first experiences is in the military, when he gets on a bus, a troop bus, and he sits in the front of he just sits down, and the people that are operating the bus tell him to get in the back of the bus. And he says, "No, I'm not moving." And that's like one of the first times for him overtly that he bumps, you know, that kind of like Rosa Parks sort of. He has his Rosa Parks moment in uniform.
In uniform.
In uniform.
Serving this country.
Yes, in uniform.
Oh my goodness.
And so, yeah, I have a photograph of him with his uniform on, and sometimes when I'll teach that, I'll put the story up and have a picture of him in military, as opposed to because everybody likes the Jackie Robinson story of integrating baseball. That's a little bit happier.
Yeah, it makes everybody feel good.
Yes, baseball
Look
as
at this
American
thing that
as
we
apple
did.
pie.
Exactly. With his baseball bat.
Yep, and his Dodgers hat. But what people don't know is the Red Sox were owned by an incredibly racist owner during this period of time when Jackie Robinson broke in. Jackie Robinson had a tryout with the Red Sox, and they said he wasn't good enough.
Maybe that's what that curse was about.
Yes. They had a tryout with him and with Willie Mays, who ended up being two of the best baseball players ever, immediately into the Hall of Fame when their careers are done, and they passed on both of them. They could have had them both in the outfield.
Imagine.
At the same time.
We could have been winners for a long time.
Yep. So I think the Red Sox doing bad this year, I attribute it to them actually going to the White House and causing a split in the team. All the white players went to the White House, and all the African American and Dominican players didn't go to the White House. Here we go.
Talk about standing in solidarity, right?
But
so here we are. All of these folks have migrated out of the South. People are coming back from the First World War. People are angry. There's a lot of that ball of fury is firing up on all sides. There's a lot of tension. I think I've read in an article that you sent us something even about, and this seems also like to just be a trend here, where some Black Americans were accused of doing something to a white woman, and it turned out it wasn't true, and that kind of also sparked some things happening. So that summer was just heated for a lot of different reasons.
Right, people were looking for a reason. People were looking for excuse. One of the bigger instances of all of this in that summer takes place in Chicago, where there's a beach on the Great Lakes, and people are swimming, and somehow people have decided in their brains that the ocean water has to be segregated, and that there's white ocean water and black ocean water, and never the twain. Is there just more
salt buoyancy? Come on.
I don't know. But anyway, a young African-American kid, I think he's maybe 13 or 14, swims over the imaginary line. And white people on the beach start chucking rocks at him. Now, it's not clear whether they actually, I've never seen like definitive, like they were trying to hit him. Maybe they were trying to splash in front of him and make him hard to completely know. But nonetheless, one of the rocks hits the kid and he drowns, which then sparks off a whole bunch of incidents in Chicago that turn into whites marching on a predominantly African-American neighborhood, burning down a whole bunch of houses. Businesses. And so one of the things that really, again, that sort of doesn't get seen in the picture is a lot of this violence. So between late 1918, the year of 1919, through the end of 1921, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 people who die, 1,500 African-American people. And historians debate whether that's even an accurate number, because some people are just buried or thrown in a river and they disappear, and nobody knows whether the number could conceivably be maybe 300 or 400 higher. But so that's horrible enough, obviously. But what also happens is when these neighborhoods are burned down, which happens in Tulsa and in other places, you're burning down black capitalism, right? So the effort that people are making to do the thing, own a small business, buy your triple decker, have your store on the bottom floor, grandma's on the top, you're in the middle, whatever it is, just like immigrants over in the acre. That all gets burned down, and so that kind of stake in the economic advancement of the race, if you will, it's like burned out. And so that, again, when people I think of that a lot when I think of the argument about reparations. Because if one of the ways you're supposed to fit in is to sort of generationally have that kind of upward mobility and whatever, but at every turn, African Americans are not allowed the piece of the pie, or they slowly get the piece of the pie and then somebody takes it away.
Yes.
Either an unscrupulous banker or a lender, or in this case, a violent mob. You're back to below zero, because you could have spent 25 years getting your stake. And now your stake is wiped out in a night of craziness.
Meanwhile, the rest of the generational wealth, and especially at that time, is all from slavery.
Right.
And people don't see how that goes hand in hand, even in the ramifications and how long it lasted to this day.
Right. Yeah, and if you think of where wealthier white people today in America are wealthy because their parents, after the Second World War or before the Second World War, whatever, were able to buy property and establish themselves, and then when they kick the bucket, they give it to their kids, and so their kids get a grub stake, right? But if in succeeding generations we've had these episodes of mass violence where then the grub stake literally goes up in smoke, it's, again, you're right. I mean, that's what Ta-Nehisi Coates was writing about in that very first article that sparked everybody's attention in his work when he wrote about reparations. And that whole article was about this stuff and about sort of that wealth being snatched away. And for me, when at least I think of this particular period of time, I see this as fundamentally important as part of it. That if you're burning out, you're burning down the buildings that house black newspapers. I mean, one of the things the African American community did, because it couldn't get itself reported fairly in the mainstream press, was start its own newspapers. And so any community of good size had a newspaper. And there were also national newspapers like the Chicago Defender and papers like that everybody read. And when you burn all that out as well, you've taken away part of that way that people tell their stories and communicate their news. So all of that's lost in this spate of violence. I mean, historians write about this period. They call it Red Summer. And some people think red means communist. But in this case, when people use Red Summer, they're actually talking about blood. They're talking about the physical violence that happens in this frenzy of a couple of years.
And people don't learn about this. This is the thing, again, most of the things that we talk about are things that I've only learned in my adult life. And by seeking this information for myself, there are things that I don't understand. And imagine a community of black people here in America knowing that there was black excellence at a time before the civil rights movement. There were people, just the fact that there were national newspapers reporting our stories, and the fact that we have to still do that today. We have to write our own stories to make sure that we're getting fair representation in the media. On it, like I think about people like Jordan Peele creating movies with just black characters, or Black Panther, and how big of a deal that was to so many of us. But we don't even know about this period of time because it's, for all intents and purposes, burned to the ground.
And or it's just left out. I mean, I have a friend who teaches at the university, and I posted something the other day about Tulsa, and she grew up in Tulsa and went to school in Tulsa as a kid and didn't know about didn't know that this had happened, didn't get it through school.
Yeah.
And so I thought, wow, I mean, and again, this is somebody who theoretically at least should have been exposed to, you would think, the history of your own town. But then when I thought about it, I said, well, a lot of kids in Lowell don't get the history of Lowell, so
Exactly.
they get a surface manifestation of that history. They don't necessarily get it. And so that's a problem, right? So again, just thinking about what has happened over the last several days, and the failure of a lot of people to understand, like, why that language, why the president's use of a certain vocabulary is code for this sort of thing, and why, again, 100 years later, here we are, right, 1919, 2019. So a lot of historians have been writing about and digging up and doing more research on what happened in 1919 because of the 100-year sort of anniversary of this incredible amount of violence in the summer of 1919. And now here we are. We have our own, right? So I can imagine somebody in, what would it be, 3019? No. What's 100 years from 2019?
Yeah. I can't do that.
2119?
We're historians. We're not
thank you.
mathematicians.
Anyway, 2119, I believe. But anyway, whatever it is, like looking, wow, now we've got 200 years.
Yeah.
We can look back on 2019 and compare it to 1919.
And it's just going to be just as bloody, it seems. And for what? Over what? And the rhetoric that I hear of these white males who are carrying their guns and just opening fire, when you can see that they were radicalized by the current inhabitant of the White House, and nobody's putting that together and calling it a mental health issue.
Right.
But we know white supremacy is not a mental health issue. It's been, if anything, again, it's pie.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing about this. I mean, in the violence that occurs in 1919, virtually nobody is punished, which is not surprising to me, but it may be surprising to listeners. There are photographs of people doing this stuff, but
photographs were rough.
And then we jump to the 1960s in this country, and when I teach about the civil rights movement, I refer to Birmingham, Alabama as Bombingham, Alabama, because there are over 75 unsolved bombings of African American schools, churches, and other things over the years leading up to civil rights struggle and the Birmingham March and Martin Luther King's work and other people's work, and the blowing up of African American church, which kills 4 young African American girls, and I think the oldest is maybe 13 or 14, and 11 and 12, blows the church up on a Sunday. So it's not like you don't know that there are people in the church. And so this is all there. And I mean, it's tricky, right? Because I don't want to, I find it difficult to just want to say it's all bad.
Right.
Because if you say it's all bad, then there's no hope. So you have to find the people that are pushing back. You have to find the people that are giving voice and saying, no, this isn't okay.
Right.
And so I think that's what, as historians, it's incumbent upon us to do, to not simply say this happened, but to say, wait, people fought back. So while all this violence is happening, there are people like Ida B. Wells, who's a champion civil rights advocate of the day, who is out front of all this saying, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And she's trying to get a federal anti-lynching bill passed, amongst other things, in terms of her crusade. The NAACP has an office on a prominent street in New York City, and every time somebody is lynched, they hang a huge flag out, not an American flag, but a flag out their office window that essentially says another lynching happened, to try to prod the American conscience, right?
This
And
keeps happening.
again, you have these newspapers, you have reporters, you have the growth of the NAACP, the growth of other civil rights organizations. The Urban League comes out of this, and so you do. And so if it's not taught properly, you can grow up in this country and think the civil rights movement started when Rosa Parks didn't get up,
Yeah.
and that nothing happened before then, either good or bad,
Right.
right? As opposed to now, again, historians are trying to are writing about this as the long civil rights movement,
Yeah.
and going back to actually even before the Civil War, with people like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass
Yeah.
and people like that, to say, and Nat Turner, or you know, insurrections in Haiti, and saying no, people have always been fighting for their freedom. You're just not being aware, and or because of the flaws in the school system, you're not getting it.
Well, who's in power? And that's who gets to disseminate the information. Even the media, the way you see, you know, these mass shooters being portrayed as boys whose brains haven't developed fully, and then, you know, you see you know, a juxtaposition of, you know, a boy like Trayvon Martin, you know, who's, you know, he's considered a menace and a terror. And I also, but to focus on the good, right? Because we want to wrap this up with something good. As I was reading about it, I noticed Carter Woodson, who started the Black History Month. He was there during that summer. Yeah. And I don't know,
he witnessed stuff in Washington.
Yeah, and he thought he was going to be lynched.
Yes.
And
he said he quietly ran away.
Yeah. And all I could think was, you know, we complain all the time that we only have this 1 month and it's the shortest month of the year, but that was the fact that we even have a month to celebrate ourselves and our history and our achievements came directly because of that. All of these civil rights icons were born of that they were born of blood. And a lot of, like, and I think about Angela Davis, who was friends with those girls that were in that church. And all of these people who have pushed for change and who inspire me, and I get to do this with you, and we get to, you know, give this information to our viewers. And I hate that this time goes by so quickly.
We're done?
We've got to wrap it up. But I'm so grateful that we get to do this, and that we get to learn from each other, and that we get to share it with everybody, because this is why we're in the state that we're in. We know this.
I thought you were going to say this is why we're in the business of being educated.
I mean, well, yeah, that's why we're doing it, right? But if we weren't doing it, then who would, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, I was saying this before we went on air, I feel like the position I have at the university, I have a job that's probably one of the most privileged, using that word correctly, one of the most privileged jobs one could have. And so to not use it, to not try to educate people, and not try to sort of say this is the deal, just seems to be me shirking my responsibility. And my dad didn't raise me, and my mom didn't raise me to shirk my responsibility.
That's
so
right.
if they're up there looking down,
I think that you're doing a great job.
I'm hoping so. But anyway,
you know, they say,
as always, a pleasure.
Always, always. And I remember reading one quote that said, and I know I'm going to butcher it, and I can't remember who said it, but when you get a little power, it's your job to bring somebody up. And I think that you're doing a great job of that, and I get to do it with you. So thank you, and thank you all for tuning in to History in Lowell.